wanted to go deeper on something called the Intercultural Development Inventory, which is a tool that I recommend different organizations to use as a way to understand their baseline for their intercultural competency, which lends an opportunity to create policies and programming and training based on where one can grow in that area. So we're going to go deeper into some core concepts. We're going to keep it geared in the tone of workplace environment. But there are many ways in which this applies to personal development or other relationships outside of work relationships. Okay, I will keep questions and commentary to the end. I will have some critical thinking questions if people are up for that sort of discussion towards the end. Other than that, I will respond to anything in the chat. Please upload any questions you may have, and I will sort of freestyle incorporate responding to them within the series. Okay, so the Intercultural Development Inventory is an assessment tool that places our individual characteristics upon a continuum. This continuum is a framework, and this framework provides a measurement that we can use to create a perspective in advancing along this continuum. We're able to understand who we are in the workplace depending on where we fall along the continuum, what that looks like in our efficiency measures, and how we can grow. Okay, so some of the core concepts to dive into would be culture, diversity, inclusion, and this intercultural competence. Culture, when you ask anyone, well, what is culture? No one could sort of pinpoint their finger on it exactly, but it is something that we all agree that we have. Culture can be broken down into two ways, either objective or subjective culture. Now, objective culture is, some like artifacts or created by a group of people, reflected in such areas as like art, architecture, literature, dance, holidays, collective history. Whereas subjective culture are patterns of interpretations, things that we can't necessarily see to the naked eye always, values, beliefs, perceptions, the way people perceive and believe or think things, behavior learned from one's group or environment that guides an individual in their day-to-day activities or in the workplace. Okay, culture is something to really understand that how we experience the world is different because of how we attach to our unique culture, and no one has the same exact culture. Diversity is a mix of differences, and this may make a difference in an interaction, whether it's individual to individual or individual to group. Differences can make a difference because it depends on context. If we all come from different cultures, how we view something subjectively can make a difference on an outcome. Do we perceive that as a threat? Do we perceive that as a problem? Do we perceive that as something we can call as a bonus or a tool? Inclusion. Inclusion is something that I think we've seen in the past couple years where, yes, we have a multicultural group, but are we actually inclusive of those groups? Or are we actually asking those groups to assimilate to the culture that is already present, even if they may not identify with that culture? Intercultural competence is the link between diversity and inclusion. This is why I wanted to go deep about this tool and this model, because oftentimes we're asking, well, how do we go beyond diversity and how do we actually reach a feeling of inclusion? What bridges these two concepts together? And intercultural competence is that answer. So if we're able to measure intercultural competence, we're also able to measure then how successful inclusion is happening with diversity measures within organizations and the workplace.
Welcome to this presentation of the Intercultural Development Inventory, or IDI.
Within this program, we will describe this tool and its practical applications as a panel of IDI qualified administrators share their real-world experiences with the inventory.
The current version of the IDI developed by Dr. Mitchell Hammer is a 50-item questionnaire that measures intercultural competence along the intercultural development continuum. This continuum, as described by IDI research, is based on validations and revisions of the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, originally proposed by Dr. Milton Bennett. Consider how you understand and behave toward people from other cultures who think and act differently from you. The IDI describes these ways of thinking, feeling, and responding to cultural differences in terms of 5 core intercultural competence mindsets and behaviors. These mindsets range from the monocultural perspectives of denial and polarization, the transitional mindset of minimization, and the intercultural or global mindsets of acceptance and adaptation.
Take a closer look at this continuum. What do you think your own primary orientation is? Research indicates you would probably not be very accurate. Does this surprise you? IDI results show that people typically overestimate their own intercultural competence. After all, it is a natural human tendency, again confirmed in research, to see ourselves as more capable than others may view us, or as more competent than we actually are. This tendency to overrate our own abilities can have positive effects. For instance, it can motivate us to reach for goals we might otherwise not try to achieve. However, when it comes to being interculturally effective, this can be a blind spot where we think we are more adaptable to cultural diversity than we actually are. The IDI allows individuals and organizations to overcome this blind spot, allowing targeted development of intercultural competence that otherwise would not be effectively achieved.
Extensive validation studies confirm the IDI is a rigorous, cross-culturally generalizable, valid, and reliable assessment of intercultural competence. Further, studies confirm this inventory is not culturally biased. IDI profile results provide real-world information on how a group or individual navigates cultural differences and commonalities. Research shows strong predictive validity of the IDI in achieving organizational objectives and educational goals.
This tool is available in an educational version and an organizational version, with results professionally prepared in customized group IDI reports, individual profile results, and tailored intercultural development plans that give you a clear map for building intercultural competencies. The IDI is translated into many languages and can be used for baseline assessments, team building, and individual coaching and development.
That was a really good, concise way of explaining the intercultural development continuum. But we'll go much deeper into those profiles. As an organization, and again, we're referring in work organizations. As a work organization, we can fall anywhere along the continuum on one of those mindsets as an average. And we know that the mass average will sway, the pendulum will impact the totality of the experience interculturally. This impacts the feeling of inclusion. This impacts conflict resolution. This impacts working together in groups and understanding things that are different work paces can still produce, the same great outcome. But how do you work with someone who has a different pace than you? But, still come to a compromise and understanding of, oh, we're just different. How do I work with that person's commonality? But how do I work with that person's difference? How do I make myself even aware of that person's difference? Depending on where you are on the continuum, you may not even be aware. So it's really great to have a pulse on the different ways that we can all show up individually and then as a group, and what that means. And when you start to see or start to assess certain goals or metrics in the workplace, we can see how diversity, lack thereof, inclusion, lack thereof impacts all of these things. Okay. So moving into the monocultural mindset, okay, denial. A denial mindset reflects a more limited experience and capability for understanding and appropriately responding to cultural differences and values, beliefs, perceptions, emotional responses, and behaviors. It consists of like a disinterest in other cultures and more of like an active avoidance of cultural difference. Okay, individuals with a denial orientation often do not see differences in perceptions and behaviors as cultural. They have limited experience usually with other cultural groups and therefore tend to operate with like broader stereotypes and generalizations that help them cope to understand. Those that in denial may also maintain a distance from other cultural groups and express little interest in learning. This could show up, let's say hypothetically, there was a workplace organization that operated in denial, or the policymakers averaged out to a denial mindset. Maybe when it came time to making policies, thinking about other holidays outside of their own never even comes to mind when it comes to creating incentives or holiday breaks. And, this is, the ways in which these our mindsets can show up tangibly in the actions that we put forth in the workplace or in interpersonal relationships. Okay, so the development strategy for someone in denial is to simply help them notice and engage cultural differences. We don't try to take someone from monocultural denial mindset all the way to the end of the continuum. That's sort of unrealistic. sort of like, skiing green and saying, you know what, tomorrow is the day that I do double blacks. It doesn't really work that way. Working the intercultural muscle takes time, but with practice and with taking it step by step, by even understanding where the steps are, we can grow and grow our work organizations. Okay. Yeah, moving on along the continuum is polarization. Okay, so polarization is an evaluative mindset. It views cultural differences from an us versus them perspective, and it can take two different forms. If you are in the defense category of polarization, you see cultural differences frequently as divisive and threatening to one's own way of doing things. You sort of feel your cultural practices are superior to the next person's or other cultural practices. Reversal and polarization. So there's defense or reversal. Reversal and polarization is where your values may idolize other cultural practices while denigrating your own. Support the cause of an oppressed group, but done with like little knowledge of what the cause means to people from the oppressed community. Other cultures are better than mine, or say for instance, oh my gosh, that community, they come together and they build a house in a week, and look at my community, barely can come together. That's an example of someone in reversal polarization on the continuum. Now, think about an organization being in polarization. An organization in polarization could constantly be creating dynamics of us versus them. It could be a very high tension because of the dynamic or the beliefs of either you or me, and very segregating. And think about if this dynamic exists within a work organization where there's nothing but working together or group efforts. I think most institutions and most organizations would like to think that they run as a team, and this department impacts this department. And if we have a work organization and polarization, what are the implications of their efficiency? What are the implications of their conflict resolution, or how much conflict resolution is even needed in the first place? Okay, some things to consider. Going further to the right of the continuum is the minimization mindset. So minimization starts to be a transitional mindset, whereas denial and polarization are considered pretty monocultural. Minimization is transitional into an intercultural or global mindset. When you're in minimization, it's basically when you highlight those commonalities. You do understand that there are differences, but you go out of your way to highlight those commonalities due to a limited understanding of the cultural self. This is more commonly experienced by dominant group members within a cultural community, and a non-dominant community, it could be a get along to go along sort of thing. Oh, I'm going to highlight my commonalities, not focus on my differences because I don't want to ruffle the feathers too much. Is something that one can say. Or, oh my gosh, I'm going to talk about how we both have daughters that are the same age, going to the same school, struggling with the same thing in school, and I'm not going to talk about our other differences in what have you, or our differences in religion, or what have you. There's so many different ways we can be different, right? Um, Minimization. So it's something, it's great because it's like, oh yes, I'm wanting to connect with you. I'm wanting to bond with you in this way. But when it comes to the things that can cause a little conflict, or things that I have to address that are maybe a little bit more uncomfortable, I'm gonna maybe avoid it, or shy away from it. And if we think about this mindset within a work organization, right? Oh, hey, we're gonna address all these things that are the same, and we're gonna highlight all these great things, and have a great pizza party about it. But the fact that there was some uncomfortable gender situation that happened, we're gonna kind of like not talk about that and sweep that under the rug, and you know, hopefully we don't have to like deal with policy on that, right? That's sort of of an example. Oh, these groups of people are going to really work well together because they have so much in common, but then these two groups of people, they really need to work together, but because they're so different, now it's getting sticky because we're being avoidant of these differences, right? So this is just a summary and an overview of how easily our perception and our intercultural competency can impact how we are in the workplace. Okay. So moving to the first level of like a global mindset. We went from monocultural mindset to a transitional mindset. Now we're moving into a more global mindset. On the continuum is considered, it's called acceptance. Now, with acceptance orientation, individuals recognize and appreciate patterns of cultural difference and commonality in their own and other cultures. So it's not just like their culture that they're fully focusing on. They're not hyper um, um, focusing on another culture and denigrating their own, none of those things. Um, and acceptance orientation is curious. They're curious to learn how a cultural pattern or behavior makes sense within different cultural communities. Um, so a lot of self-reflection between one's own culture, um, and learned perceptions and behaviors, and the perceptions and practices of different cultural groups. Um, Individuals in the acceptance mindset are not fully able to adapt necessarily to the cultural difference, but they're curious about it. They want to explore it. They're open to being in the room about it. But when it comes to maybe acting it out themselves, they're maybe a little hesitant, you know? So if we consider the strategy for helping individuals or work organizations within acceptance, it would be to interact more across cultures in ways that expand the knowledge about the cultural differences. So it's like, yes, you can respect it. Understand that you maybe witnessed this or that, but actually participating in it, um, finding more opportunities to participate in cultural differences, engage authentically, is a way to move forward, or along the continuum after acceptance. Acceptance in the work, if we're translating it into a work environment, this organization may have that approach of oh, let's do a lot of surveying of our staff. Let's see where they're at. Let's see what we can do to better integrate things that are different, or hear any feedback where we can grow. Those are examples that, showing a level of curiosity um, in order to understand, cultural patterns more authentically. Um, Creating policy in a way where, other, um, all cultural groups are thought of, or, there's questions about, okay, yes, we know that we should do this. Now the conversations are at the tables about what policy should be created and why, in order to incorporate all of these genders, or in order to incorporate all of these, diverse cultural groups, or these diverse age sets. So that's an example. And as we see, we're getting more and more productive in inclusion. We're getting more and more productive towards efficiency within working across a wider net of individuals. At the end of the continuum to the right is adaptation, also intercultural global mindset. And it consists of a cognitive frame shifting, shifting one's cultural perspective. And in the other series, I go deeper into cognitive psychology, and this definitely overlaps in that way. But there's also this behavioral code shifting, changing behavior in an authentic and culturally appropriate way. We saw an acceptance where there's this curiosity to do so, and we're thinking about it, and we want to be there to think about the opportunity or the chance of maybe one day when I might prepare to. But in adaptation, we're diving right in. We're at the cultural fest, and we're dressed appropriately, and we're eating the foods that are available, and we're taking in some of the cultures much more deeply, tangibly, I would say. And if we're processing this in a work organization framework, this framework helps, excuse me, this framework helps focus on learning adaptive strategies, right? What's one of the most important things in any organization is learning, is knowing how to adapt and knowing how to change. Problems can arise when people with adaptation mindset express like little tolerance towards people who engage diversity from other developmental orientations, like polarization. Why don't they get it, or why don't they understand things to the way that I do? So even when someone is in adaptation, there's still room to grow. There's still room for strengthening the intercultural muscle from their standpoint. And one of the ways in which you would do that is developing deeper patience, understanding other levels of developmental orientations and what they need to get to their next level, as opposed to necessarily being where you are if you're in adaptation. Okay. So adaptation could, in a lot of great ways, be very inclusive and comfortable for all, because they generate policies and group measures that are effective, because it's inclusive of multiple people. and different cultural groups. But in the same sense, they can be very zero tolerance or unforgiving to those on the left of the continuum in their developmental orientation, right? And we want to understand that people all innately want to do good. And because of our environments and the things that have developed and shaped our culture thus far, make us all different, we don't necessarily want to denigrate someone or ourselves because of where we are or because of our experiences. Understanding that there is a way for all of us to strengthen that muscle, right? Just like the people that, hey, I want to make this body transformation, and with the right amount of time and effort, leveling up in a way that fits for them, they meet their goals. And the same thing is possible in intercultural competency.
How would you assess the intercultural competence of your workplace?
How is your workplace impacted by cultural diversity?
The current Intercultural Development Inventory, or IDI, developed by Dr. Mitchell Hammer, answers these types of questions as it measures 5 core mindsets and associated behaviors of intercultural competence. The Intercultural Development Continuum describes these mindsets from monocultural to intercultural, each mindset generating very different approaches for engaging diversity and creating an inclusive environment. The monocultural end of the continuum begins with denial and polarization. A denial orientation sees more observable cultural differences, but often does not notice deeper cultural patterns, for example, in conflict resolution styles. Polarization notices difference, where difference is often negatively judged from an us versus them viewpoint. One form of polarization is defense, being less critical towards one's own cultural values and practices and overly critical towards others. Another form of polarization is reversal, an overly critical view towards one's own group and an uncritical view towards the practices of other communities. Polarization mindsets value employees who can quickly be brought up to speed on how we do things around here. Denial and polarization mindsets produce an assimilationist approach to talent staffing, where diverse talent is expected to fit into the workplace, largely defined by the dominant cultural group. In the workplace, assimilation can take the form of sink or swim for new hires. Leaders with this mindset typically assume new hires can figure out how things are done in the organization, just like they did. Behaving differently from how things are done here often has negative consequences, resulting in diverse individuals often feeling ignored, uncomfortable, and experiencing a sense of bias as their contributions go unrecognized.
In the middle of the continuum is minimization, a transitional orientation between monocultural and intercultural mindsets. This mindset values commonalities but de-emphasizes difference. For dominant group members, minimization tends to lack deeper cultural self-awareness, including awareness around power and privilege.
For non-dominant group members, minimization is often a strategy to adjust to the dominant culture's values and practices. For example, a go-along to get along strategy. With a minimization mindset, leadership typically supports a universalist approach by focusing on the elimination of bias through common policies that assure equal opportunity for all. Clearly, these efforts improve cross-cultural relations, yet the universalist approach does not address how to value diversity or bridge across cultural differences. As a result, diverse perspectives and experiences are typically not fully heard. On the other end of the continuum are intercultural or global mindsets. Acceptance understands and appreciates culturally diverse perspectives and behavior, while adaptation is responsive and adaptive to difference. These mindsets create a cultural bridge model in organizations and educational institutions.
In this approach, cultural differences are integrated into the organization's DNA. Domestic and international diversity are seen as resources for multicultural team effectiveness, and cultural competence applies to everyone. The Cultural Bridge approach supports diversity and inclusion goals with its focus on intercultural competence building and mutual adaptation. The result is diversity feels understood, valued, and engaged in the mission and life of the organization or educational institution. The IDI, measuring and tracking the progress of intercultural competence along the intercultural development continuum.
For additional information, visit our website or contact us.
Great. So I think that did a really good job in just sort of bringing home the different mindsets and the implications at work. So just reiterating some developmental tasks and organizational implications of these mindsets, and then we can go into any questions or critical thinking if we have anyone. Okay, so in the denial mindset, again, it's little recognition of more complex cultural differences. And if we're thinking about developmentally, how do we move past this? It would be recognition of non-threatening cultural differences. So things that wouldn't stir the pot too much, if you will, would be the bridge into that. Organizational implications. Denial organization is, generally unaware about cultural issues. This means that they can be susceptible to being blindsided by like a race, gender, or cultural issue that could be happening. Sometimes these things can be festering or going on for quite some time before an organization is even aware that it's a problem. And by that time, they have a really big problem, and then there's a climate of inattentiveness for cultural differences. Okay, and polarization, the developmental task and moving through polarization again, which is like the judgmental orientation, the us versus them, would be to reduce the polarization by equalizing criticism and finding more common humanity between the supposed groups or the different groups. Polarization, organization, implications, there could be a sense of superiority, which could lead to an overconfidence, like we know best sort of corporate structure. There could be diversity recruitment, but retention efforts are half-hearted and often unsuccessful. There could be an evaluative stance that could damage domestic and international partnerships. And those things can go deeper. With minimization, the developmental task and moving forward, again, reminding and minimization is when you're highlighting cultural commonalities, but you're potentially masking deeper recognition of cultural differences. Developmental task would be to increase the cultural self-understanding, increase focus on understanding cultural differences. So understanding the depths in which you are different yourself, or an organization is different itself. Organizational implications of minimization could be overestimating cross-cultural competence to global and domestic diversity issues. Tolerance or maybe colorblind policies may lead to poor recruitment and retention of diverse resources, because they're posting, hey, we're looking for all this common stuff, right? And it may technically be screaming by avoidance, we don't want the other stuff, right? Even though that's not the intention, but that is what can happen. And that's why it's really important to, as we're assessing these mindsets, is to understand that while it may not be the intention, it still can surface. Minimization, there can be an overemphasis on corporate culture, creating a strong pressure to conform, hair standards or clothing standards or things of that nature. Lacks a deeper appreciation of diversity as a resource because diverse groups show up differently. And if you ask people to always show up the same, you're automatically asking the diverse groups to not show up. Okay, acceptance. Acceptance, developmental task, moving forward. Again, reminding acceptance recognizes the cultural commonality and differences in one's own and other cultures. Increasing self-understanding, understanding of cultural differences, and actually engaging in the culturally adaptive behavior would be the areas of improvement or opportunity for acceptance. Organizational implications would be like a bridging. So if a work organization is within acceptance, there could be active efforts to recruit and actually retain diverse workforce, able to talk the talk, but not exactly walk the walk consistently, not really sure why. Recognizing local cultural contexts as different from one's own, but finding difficulty in taking the appropriate action that shows different cultures they are included. Managers are encouraged to value cultural diversity, but not exactly trained on these intercultural skills. So it's almost like in acceptance, it's like, okay, we're there, we're talking about it, we're trying to do things about it, but we may be missing the mark on how to exactly do it because we're not used to engaging in it ourselves, right? An example of that could be, tangibly celebrating all of the possible holidays in December. We're not just going to, celebrate one or another. We're going to actively celebrate them all, right? What is it like when we actually actively celebrate them all? What comes about? What do we learn? What happens? What unlocks within our mind or our thought process that allows us to think differently about how we approach something or how we problem solve or how we create a policy. Okay. In adaptation, reminder again, it is the ability to shift cultural perspective and actually adapt behavior to the cultural context appropriately. There is still developmental tasks in strengthening the intercultural muscle here, and that would be, attaining bicultural and or multicultural adaptation. So oftentimes in adaptation, it's like, well, I have engaged enough where I can effectively speak to this. I can feel comfortable being in the room authentically, if you will. But when it comes to slipping in and out multiculturally as if the other culture is the same as my own, that comes another level of strengthening that muscle, right? I'm sure it has a lot of, it could be compared to bilingual or multilingual speakers, right? Depending on where they are, who they're with, what setting they're in, the language multiculturally or free-flowingly changes, right? So that is an example of, adaptation, right? Um, Organizational implications of adaptation in bridging. Um, Organization encourages development of intercultural competence among all staff, right? There isn't the I'm shying away from learning about where we are because I'm afraid of what can happen, about what solutions come about, what to do with it, Um, Domestic and international cultural differences are used as a resource for multicultural teams and, the organization as a whole. And there's a strong climate of respect for diversity. And, time and time again, there are countless studies that show higher diversity equals higher success or higher easier making the goals and metrics set by organizations. And so this is something that we want to strengthen and develop. It creates a more comfortable environment for our work peers who we often, care about. And it strengthens our ability to have deeper interpersonal relationships, even outside of the workplace. Understanding this continuum where we all can fall, how we may show up, being self-aware of where we are, taking the assessment. I am a qualified administrator of this assessment. Taking the assessment, it gives an intercultural development plan. Actually having a plan based off of where you are is really important, from a work organization standpoint and also a personal standpoint. Okay, so I want to go ahead and play this last video. It's just a quick case study here about the IDI.
A large healthcare business became the #1 regional company for diversity and inclusion. The company formed a diversity leadership council consisting of senior vice presidents from each business unit. The council was given a daunting task: develop a 3-year strategic diversity plan, and then implement this plan across more than 6,000 managers and employees. The cornerstone of this effort was the use of the Intercultural Development Inventory, facilitated by Mary Frances Winters, an IDI qualified administrator. Each council member first took the IDI. Ms. Winters then reviewed their group IDI profile with the council, focusing on their intercultural strengths and opportunities. This was followed up with individual IDI debrief sessions for each person. In monthly meetings, members engaged in learning activities geared toward increasing a deeper understanding of the challenges and needs of diversity within the business. At the end of the year, the IDI was re-administered to the council members. The result demonstrated bottom-line impact. First, polarization was eliminated. Minimization reduced almost 25%. And the intercultural mindsets of acceptance and adaptation dramatically increased. Second, council members became more curious about differences and supportive of diversity initiatives. Third, leadership volunteered more as sponsors for affinity groups. Fourth, 100% of all senior leaders participated in non-mandatory formal diversity training. And fifth, more formalized programs were re-established to understand the organization's diverse customer base.
So yes, so that concludes, I feel like that was a lot of new information, a lot of core concepts. a lot of new ways to consider our workplace environment and how it impacts our peers and our workflow. And this is something that we can go much deeper on after understanding this summary or this basis of our intercultural competency and start to how we can strengthen that muscle personally and how it can trickle to in the workplace environment.